The curious case of Isaiah Collier, how the number one high school player in the country in a bad draft is now a 15th pick, makes no sense at all. We delve in next on Locked on Jazz. Bum 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 bum.
You are Locked on Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
How are you? I am David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA Insider. On today's edition of Locked on Jazz, the curious case of Isaiah Collier, the 6'5", seemingly perfect 210-pound guard out of Georgia that was the number one recruit in the country, is now almost guaranteed seemingly to be on the board for the Jazz at 10. Why not? What's the story? Why has everyone gone sour on Isaiah Collier in a bad draft? What style is winning in the NBA? A year ago, the handoff was the in thing with Nikola Jokic and Domantas Sabonis. Let's look at the Mavericks, the Wolves, the Pacers, and the Celtics, and where do they rank in pick and roll? Where do they rank in drives? Where do they rank in handoffs? Where do they rank in isolation? What about off-ball screens, which we run a lot of? What about passes? Do passes matter? We'll look at all of those things today on Locked on Jazz as well. Plus, a little bit of look at Indiana-Boston last night. And as I told you, I thought Indiana had a real chance because of Al Horford, and they just went at him all night. But there were some interesting numbers, one or two that's not that encouraging for Indiana, actually, when it gets down to it. Or you can say it's encouraging. You decide. Anyway, I am David Locke, the radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA Insider. This is Locked on Jazz. It's your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz, giving you insight, expertise, geeky numbers, and hopefully making it way better to be a Jazz fan each and every day. Thank you so much for making Locked on Jazz your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all podcasting apps. We're also on YouTube. On the apps, please subscribe on YouTube. Please follow and then hit the bell button so you're notified. Participate in the chat. Give us a thumbs up. We appreciate it. And to the everydayers, you're the best. Thanks for making us what we are today. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. So Isaiah Collier went to USC as the number one recruit in the country. They got both the number one recruits in the country in men and women's basketball last year. Juju Watkins and Isaiah Collier. And Collier is 19 years old, and he's 6'5", and he's 210 pounds, and he is suddenly dropping in the draft. He has become kind of maybe Shepard is the most debated. Edey is the most interesting. Collier is the biggest mystery at this point. On the latest edition of the Ringer's mock draft, which who knows how good it is, but it gives you a ballpark, he's 19th. So when you look at a player, there's certain things that like generally kind of almost are like, yeah, sure. McDonald's All-American, Nike Hoop Summit, and then there haven't been many Mr. Georgia basketballs that have ever missed, right? Like from Favors to Anthony Edwards to Dwight Howard to Mr. Georgia basketball hits. So he knocks all this off. Is there an injury? He had a knee injury after his junior year while he's playing the under 18s. He's been on the circuit the entire time as one of the top prospects in the country. And he goes to USC and he scores 16 points, 3 rebounds, 4 assists. He shoots 49% from the field, 34% from the three. And then in his finals, he has a hand injury. In his final 7 games, he comes back. He averages 19 points, 4 assists. He shoots 46% from the field, 36% from 3, and looks really good. So let's start with the first thing. Guys that are 1, 2, or 3 in recruiting out of high school, do they miss? So maybe. Last year was Dariq Whitehead, who then had injuries. Derek Lively and Nick Smith was the men's recruiting services consensus, and Nick Smith seems only okay. Chet Holmgren, Jaden Hardy, who ended up being a second-round pick after not going, to Paolo Banchero, to Jabari Smith. That's pretty good. Cade Cunningham, Jalen Green, Evan Mobley. Pretty solid. James Wiseman, Isaiah Stewart, Cole Anthony. Not as good. That was a bad class, that 2019 class. RJ Barrett, Cam Reddish, Zion Williamson. Marvin Bagley, Michael Porter Jr., DeAndre Ayton, Josh Jackson, Harry Giles, Lonzo Ball in 2016. That's Jason Tatum was tied for third with Lonzo Ball, so that makes that a little better. 2015 was Ben Simmons, Skal Labissiere, and Jaylen Brown. So yeah, it seems as though every year there seems to be a guy that's in the high school top players in the country that doesn't kind of pan out. And if you look at the next year in 2014, Jahlil Okafor, Emmanuel Mudiay, and Stanley Johnson, you begin to see a little bit of a pattern that on Emmanuel Mudiay and Stanley Johnson that would bother you about Isaiah Collier and a little bit on Nasir Little as well. And I mentioned a little bit on Isaiah Stewart, who we mentioned there also, would be that physically they were so developed, so much quicker than anyone else, that they were able to use their size and power to just purely dominate. So that's what Isaiah Collier does. His strength is his size, but you can't bully the NBA. But he's incredibly explosive. He's incredibly strong. He's willing to play with contact. He's got a great body, not a great wingspan, great body. 6'5", 210. Wingspan didn't turn out to be very big. What are the concerns? Why would a guy who comes with all of these accolades suddenly drop? Well, he only takes 3 threes a game. He only made them at 34%. And then the big glaring weakness. And that's a 67% free throw percentage. His shot's ugly. It's got no elevation to it, a lot of arms, fundamentally not right. But this goes to a reoccurring theme on all the criticisms of Isaiah Collier. They all go to a lack of fundamentals. So he doesn't shoot it quite right. Okay, that's probably fixable. Now, the 67% free throw shooting is not the greatest sign ever. Defensively, really poor. Okay, what 19-year-old's not? There's criticism for him for too many turnovers and decision-making. Okay, he's been the best player on the floor every game he ever played in his entire life, physically superior to everyone until he went to USC, and then still probably some of the time. And so you can view this one of two ways. Why would a player have developed some of these fundamentals if they don't need to? Right? The game has not said to him yet, oh, you've got to learn this. It will now. It will now. It will now tell him, oh, by the way, you've got to develop this. Colin Sexton will learn that. Colin Sexton fits a lot of these molds. Explosive, athletic, rim finishing, physical, willing to play, great athleticism, super in transition, open floor, dynamic. A lot of these fit because he's physically so much better than everyone else. Why? Why, if you're physically better than everyone else, have you had to learn any of these things? You haven't. So turnovers, get sloppy, had a bunch of plays in college where he drove in the lane, got in trouble, too many got, okay, well, he's never experienced that before. We can't expect guys to intuitively have these things. So when you evaluate Isaiah Collier and you look at his weaknesses, which are lack of three-point shooting, okay, this is the one that's concerning me. The one that's concerning me is lack of three-point shooting and 67% from the free throw line. But when I look at his turnovers, that just needs to be taught. But you can't teach a first step. Some of the passing and some of the things you can't teach. Some of the anticipation, you can't teach. Shot fundamentals are bad. Makes me nervous. But you can't make Rob Dillingham become 6'5", 210 pounds. Frankly, you can't make Reed Sheppard do that either. You can never turn Isaiah Collier into the shooter that Reed Sheppard was last year. Reed Sheppard's a little interesting because he wasn't that shooter for his entire high school career, which is making some people nervous. But when I look at Isaiah Collier, I'm beginning to wonder if all of the criticisms are simply being 19 years old playing college basketball. College basketball is not a great place for someone to be evaluated. I find myself wanting to go back and watch other stuff. And I look at the resume and say, McDonald's All-American Hoop Summit, when playing his age group, the best player in the class, one of the 5 best players in the world in his age class every single time. Like, I think I'd take a flyer on that at 10. I think I'd take a flyer on that faster than I'd take a flyer on Stephen Castle, actually. This is where this draft is crazy because you can see where draft boards go nuts. I need to watch more, and I haven't watched enough yet. But I might have Isaiah Collier ahead of Stephen Castle, but I also might have Devin Carter ahead of both of them. Okay, well, that's the inverse of everyone's draft board. But I think there's going to be a lot of draft boards in the NBA offices that have that kind of inverse viewpoint also, because of exactly what I'm talking about. And yesterday we had a great debate about who is it that are you a Isaiah Collier guy? Excuse me, are you a Devin Carter guy, or are you a Stephen Castle guy? Like, I think that became a pretty interesting debate yesterday. And when you start looking at that debate and how these things played out, I think you end up, defining a little bit of who you are and how you view things. And then that ends up giving you a little bit of an idea of where you probably find yourself making, who you vote for, what type of player you choose. Well, now how do you fit this in to this? Right? Like, how do you put in Isaiah Collier, who has this background? Discuss it. It's fun. It's what the whole draft is all about. And then you got a guy like Leaf Tulane who fills in for us and does an even better job. All right, NBA. What do we learn from Boston, Indiana, Dallas, and the Wolves in the style in which they play in a copycat league about where teams are going and what's happening? It's a dramatic shift from where we were just 1 year ago in the NBA. We're talking about it next because we're just getting started on Locked On Jazz. Wednesday edition of Locked On Jazz is brought to you by my good friends over at Intercap Lending. Steve Carter is the best. And I got to hook somebody up with Steve Carter yesterday, so that made me super happy. Nothing makes me happier than the email that says, "Hey, Locke, you've told me so much about Intercap Lending, and you've told me so much about Steve Carter. Could you please help me out?" And this was an interesting one. This was not a house loan. This was this was fundraising to help see if the guy could raise enough money to buy out his partners. I mean, that's the kind of stuff Intercap Lending can do for you. Steve Carter is our own personal loan officer over at Intercap Lending and does just amazing work. So if you're looking for a loan right now, email me at dlock09@gmail.com. That's dlock09@gmail.com. And we'll help you out, get you that connection. The reviews from Locked On Jazz listeners are always great. Michelle Reynolds wrote, "I can't say enough about Steve. He went above and beyond to help me when I thought I wasn't going to be possible. He also worked his tail off to get my loan approved, closed, and funded as fast as he can make it happen. Thank you for such a positive, easy experience. Truly wonderful to work with. Thank you so much." Steve Carter, Intercap Lending. If you're looking for a loan right now, feel free to give me an email at dlock09@gmail.com. That's dlock09@gmail.com so I can hook you up with Steve Carter. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time, the Game Time app. Download the app today. Game Time, and be in the place to get yourself tickets. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off your first purchase. For concerts this summer, if you're in Utah, whether it's Red Butte, the place formerly known as USANA, whatever it might be, last-minute deals. Save up to 60% on buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater. Flash deals. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on secret seats ahead of the game or event. Zone deals, tell it what zone you're looking for, and you get there. Plus, all-in pricing, seat views, lowest price guaranteed. That's why the Game Time app is doing it all. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply again. Create an account, redeem LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Game Time app, last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jazz your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all podcasting apps, as well as on YouTube. Thanks for the conversation and the discussion. I was trying to see our poll results from yesterday and trying to figure out where I can see it. I do not see the poll results from yesterday on the YouTube. Maybe it didn't come through on the YouTube. I did post it later than usual yesterday. I was testing something to see if it worked. We'll go back to posting at a regular time, I think. But good conversation on YouTube yesterday with everyone. If you have not checked out Locked On Sports Today's 24/7 national sports channel, it's pretty awesome. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or grab it over on Amazon Fire TV and check out the biggest stories. They'll have Pacers and Celtics today, all covering all the biggest stories and the reaction to the game last night, plus preview you what's going on. Let's see. I was trying to see if I have the NBA update. I do. Already airing in just a minute while I'm recording this will be Celtics followed by Pacers. A Mavs-Wolves crossover will air at about 9 a.m. and a Mavs-Wolves crossover part 2 will air at about 9:30 a.m. plus both of those airing at about 4:30 and 5 o'clock tonight to get you ready for that ball game. So that'll be great. All right. Boston, Indiana, Dallas, Toronto. I looked at 6 categories of how they play. Pick and roll. Wolves run the 8th most pick and roll in the NBA. Indiana runs the 10th most pick and roll in the NBA. Dallas runs, surprisingly, with Luka, the 15th most pick and roll in the NBA. And Boston runs the 18th most pick and roll in the NBA. So, what's our quick takeaway there? This was, at one point in time, a complete pick and roll league. Then last year, I thought we moved away from it. My watching the playoffs, my eyeball test has been that it really has seemed to me as though we were going to head back to being a pick and roll league. When we get into the frequency of pick and roll, these teams are all right about average, right? 8th, 10th, 15th, and 18th. Now, for the season and the playoffs combined, or I could just do the regular season or just the playoffs. I don't know which matters, but I have. So we'll go just regular season. Boston was the number 1 pick and roll team in the league. Indiana was the number 4 pick and roll team in the league. Dallas was the number 9 pick and roll team in the league, and Minnesota was number 13th in efficiency. So first thing I gave you was volume. So all these teams, Wolves run the 8th most, Indiana runs the 10th most, Mavs run the 15th most, and Boston runs 18th most. But when you dig in to the ability to go score off of pick and roll, the number 1 pick and roll team in the league this year was Boston. And when they spread the floor and they have Kristaps, you can understand why. And the number 4 pick and roll team in the league was Indiana, and the number 1 pick and roll combination in the league was Halliburton and Turner. And Dallas with Luka was the 9th best pick and roll team in the league, and Minnesota was 13th. That's pretty good. We were 22nd. We're heading back into a level of like pick and roll. Fundamentally, the top 7 pick and roll teams in the league were in the playoffs. 10 of the top 11 were in the playoffs. We're still there. How about drives? Just breaking down, getting in the basket, getting in lane, driving to the basket. Indiana has the 3rd most drives of any team in the NBA. The Wolves have the 9th most. But interestingly, Boston is 27th and Dallas is 23rd. So this one really has to do with a little bit of personnel. Boston's not a drive team. Dallas is not a drive team. But Indiana and Minnesota is. The number 1 drive team in the NBA in efficiency, Boston. Dallas is number 3. Indiana's number 5. And Minnesota's 16th. Minnesota's offense is unusual to be here. But that gets, again, okay, so we're not high necessarily driving a lot, but when they are driving, the 1, 3, and 5 teams are the teams left. Last year, the in thing in the league was handoffs, right? Jokic, high post. We talked about Olynyk all the time on the show, the league heading that direction, running a high post offense, running the handoffs off it, doing all that kind of stuff. And this year, the number 1 handoff teams in the league continued. Sacramento was number 1 in the league with the most handoffs, and then by a lot, then Cleveland and Brooklyn and New York and Philadelphia, and there was a definite increase in handoffs in the NBA. However, the Wolves are 10th in the league in handoffs per 100 possessions. And then these other teams aren't. Indiana's 16th. Boston runs the fewest of anyone in the NBA, and Dallas runs very few handoffs as well. They rank 26th. In fact, Dallas is good at it. They're the 2nd best, and Boston's the 4th best, and Indiana's the 6th best. And Minnesota's the 11th best, but they don't do it very often. One thing we're seeing here that's super interesting is you better be really good at a lot of different things offensively. Remember last year, Miami makes this run. Everyone's surprised by it. And I had talked about how I'd watched the final 5 minutes of every game in the NBA that year. and of every close game in the NBA that year. And the biggest thing to me about Miami was that Miami had so many different things they did late in games. They had played the most close games late, and they had so many different things to do. I think we're seeing a little bit here of a versatility of these teams, that they're all good at just about everything they do and have the personnel to go take whatever they need to go get. Is it an isolation league again? The number one isolation team in the league was the Clippers. Dallas is number 2 with Luka. Boston is number 4. I say this begrudgingly. Minnesota is the 11th highest isolation team in the league. Isolation's boring. Indiana's 28th. They don't isolate. They move the ball. They do all this other stuff. But here's gets interesting again. Okay? Dallas was the number 1 efficiency isolation team in the league. Indiana, despite only running 13 isolations per 100 possessions compared to Dallas's 24, was the number 2 isolation team in the league. Boston was number 5 and Minnesota was number 8. Hate to say it, but when it gets right down to it, you better have guys that can just beat people in isolation. You really better just have it. You might not want to live by it. Might not be what you want to do all the time. Might be Indiana where you're 28th in the league, but they're the second best team in the league at doing it when they have to. When they can find the matchup. When Siakam's guarded by Horford. I thought this was interesting. Off-ball screens. This is what we do. We ran some of the most off-ball screens in the league. It's basically running a pick and roll without a ball handler. It's doing all sorts of cool things. We actually ended up running the second most behind the Warriors. This was the Warriors' whole thing, playing this way. Okay, this is not how any of these teams play. Minnesota is 15th in the league with off-ball screens because they're getting Anthony Edwards the ball with Mike Conley as a point guard. But Boston's 26th, Indiana's 20th, and the Mavs are 24th. Mavs are 23rd. That's not what these teams do. But again, Boston's the best off-ball screen team in the league when they need to be. Indiana's the second best. Dallas is 11th, and Minnesota's 12th. So these teams are all very good at lots of different things offensively. Which means you've got enough personnel to go find them. You might not run a lot of off-ball screens to Anthony Edwards, but when you need to go get him one, you get him one. It's pretty good. When Boston might not run a lot of off-ball screens to Jalen or Jason Tatum, but what they need to, they get them. Here was the most interesting thing to me about this. So we just did this whole run through that you have to be, what we've kind of discovered is that these teams are actually good at just about everything. You have to be versatilely good at a multitude of different things to do this. But we're not like a heavy dosage of pick and roll. Drives are not universally there. Handoffs have reduced a great deal. Isolation is still prominent, and they're good at it. Off-ball screens seem to be kind of blasé unless when you really need it. You know what's actually the number one thing that's the unifier between both these teams and makes it interesting and has not been something that's been a real indicator to winning very often? Passes. Indiana throws the most passes of any team in the NBA this year. Minnesota throws the 8th most amount of passes of any team in the NBA. Boston was 26th in the league in passing, so they don't pass it quite as much. And who did I not mention? Minnesota? Minnesota was 8th. Dallas was 28th. So Boston, so interestingly, on passes, Indiana was 1. So Indiana's moving it to get to all this stuff. Dallas and Boston, they don't pass it. They're playing that ISO, Luka, Tatum, Brown, but yet they're good at all of these other things when they need to be. And then Minnesota does move it. Minnesota moves it a lot. So I thought that was really surprising that all the teams are good at things. They all do something differently, right? So Boston predominantly is they run the 4th most isolations, the 18th most pick and rolls. They don't run handoffs. They don't run off-ball screens, and they don't drive. Okay. Indiana runs the most passes of any team in the league. They're the 3rd highest drive team, so they drive and kick. And they're the 10th highest pick and roll team, so they pick and roll and kick and then move it. But they don't run off-ball screens. They don't run a lot of handoffs, and they don't run isolation. Dallas doesn't pass it. They're going to run isolation, pick and roll, and they're going to get everyone to collapse on Luka or Kyrie and make one pass out instead of swinging it. And then Minnesota is super interesting in how wide-ranging and versatile they are. 8th in picks, 9th in drives, 10th in handoffs, 11th in isolation, 16th in off-ball screens. Chris Finch has about the widest variety of anyone there, and then they're 8th in the league in passes. Pretty interesting. I thought it was really interesting. Shift for the league. All right, let's talk about last night's game between Indiana and Boston because it was awesome, and there's some interesting notes on it, and we'll get you ready for that. And then a fascinating note about Rudy Gobert, and we'll talk more about it on tomorrow's show coming up as we're still going on Locked on Jazz. Next episode, or next part of Locked on Jazz is brought to you by BetterHelp. Convenient, flexible, online therapy for you. I've talked about this before. I like to think of therapy as performance enhancing, right? Like you go to the gym, work out your muscles, you run, you bike, you do all these things to get yourself in better physical condition. Well, therapy is to help you with better mental conditioning, where you might, mind control, body mindfulness, all that kind of stuff. That's what therapy is. And so whether or not, however it might work for you and however significant your issue is, it is still what you need to work on. I hear a lot of people, I don't need to go to therapy because other people have bigger problems. Okay, but it's still in your world, in your issue, it's helpful. So visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch the therapist at any time. I have a friend who just had a new kid, and it's got their second kid, and the stress of the house and everything else just kind of overwhelmed him. And he's like, I'm going to try it. And he did BetterHelp. And he's like, wow, this is like remarkably helpful to me and allowing me to see things about myself I wouldn't know otherwise. So go check it out at BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. Thanks so much for making Locked on Jazz your first listen of the day. So where are my notes on this? In the midst of the excitement of the show, I seem to have possibly deleted the page and the tab. So funny. I do all sorts of reviews of our shows all the time. And if one of our hosts did this, I would be so mad at them right now. But I apologize. I had up something that about Indiana Boston last night on a tab here to share with you, and hopefully it'll come up quickly. Sometimes this does not. So it did. Good. All right. I thought some things about last night's game. First of all, that game was so fun, and Indiana just blew it, and it's tragic because I actually think this series can now be close to a sweep. They just threw up the ball. If you didn't watch it, Indiana kind of had control, was down 12-0, fired back, had control of the game. Tyrese Haliburton dribbled off his foot once and just lost the ball twice late on key plays. They started turning the ball over. Pascal Siakam took the worst route I've ever seen to the basketball on an inbound play, and they turned it over, and that's where Carlisle has said that it was his fault because he should have called the timeout. So there's a lot of stuff. There were about 100 shots in the game. Indiana shot lights out and didn't win, so that's got me a little concerned for them. Though I thought Indiana would cause a lot of problems to Boston without Kristaps Porzingis because they would be able to go after Al Horford, and they went after Al Horford every single play. And it's stunning to me that Boston doesn't have somebody else to go after, to put out there. It's kind of an incredible thing. So few notes on this game. To what we were just talking about, Indiana threw 370 passes last night. It's a crazy number. 45 kickouts. They did run 25 handoffs. Indiana ran 81 pick and rolls last night, but they were totally inefficient. They were 0.83 points per pick and roll. They were good in transition. They actually ran a little bit of a handoff game last night, which versatile. To our point of like this versatility that we're talking about, might not be one thing. They ran 81 picks, 41 drives, 25 handoffs, and 16 isolations. Okay, Boston ran 63 picks, 46 drives, 26 isolations, and were really successful on those. They ran 11 pickups, only 8 handoffs. So you do have to have this versatility. One thing that's interesting is Boston thrived in transition last night. They were in 31 transition opportunities last night, had 26 points. Indiana was only in 17. So as much as Indiana was the one pushing the pace, and Bob Myers at halftime insanely said that he thought that Boston should really slow it down and make it a bloodbath. That's the exact opposite. When you put Boston doesn't want to play in a cage. Boston wants to play open and free, and those guys use their athleticism, and they can play Indiana's game, and that's why last night's loss is so brutal. I really think this could be a sweep from here on out. I thought that was a pretty good shot. What's interesting on last night's game is Boston flipped between switching and dropping the big about the same amount of time, and actually had, I think, more effectiveness with dropping the big, even though it was ugly when they missed. Same thing on Indiana. Teams that are switching defensively are not having a great deal of success in the playoffs right now. I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I mean, I don't know if it's simply that teams are getting exploited or what, but Al Horford was really interesting last night. There were two things that were interesting. One is Al Horford started the night on Miles Turner, and Indiana started to abuse that. So then they switched Al Horford to Pascal Siakam so that Miles Turner was no longer involved in the pick and roll, which is a pretty interesting move by Missoula. And then Siakam starts to live with that 15-foot jump shot over the top of Horford. Then Boston started literally just bumping everyone out. Al Horford was just staying, and everybody was bumping out. And they did that fairly well, but still Indiana was able to score on it. Boston's entire defense right now is about protecting Al Horford, which is hard to do. And it's where when Kristaps Porzingis comes back and they'll be more complete. But they really did just go at Al Horford almost every play. And I would give Missoula credit. I would rather have them running a pick and roll with Pascal Siakam than I would having them run it with Miles Turner. Turner popping and Haliburton getting the basket. I think it was the first or second play of the third quarter where Turner pops, Horford doesn't know where to go, and Haliburton just gets the basket uncontested. On this night, Indiana was better efficiency-wise on the Haliburton-Siakam pick and roll, but the Haliburton-Turner two-man game is the best two-man game in the NBA this year. So anything that Boston's doing to get rid of that, I think, is a real positive for Boston in that regard. The one that's interesting for me to watch in the rest of the series is if Indiana can stop Boston's transition at all, which I don't know if they can because of the way they play. I'm not entirely sure Boston just – they have such great isolation players, and they're so good across the board. They're the number one offensive team just because of all those things we just talked about. But I'm curious to watch if they get stymied at all. They had a very good offensive game last night based on transition. They didn't seem to have like awesome pick and roll answers, but they just seem to be good enough. But their isolation drive game, they do have a mismatch on just about everything. They were unbelievable on the drive game last night. I think they were probably over 1.2 points per from what I looked at last night. So interesting, really interesting series because of the fact that you have this Al Horford matchup with Kristaps Porzingis out, and they're just going after it on every single possession. All right. That is Locked on Jazz today. Hope you enjoyed. We will continue to bring more content for you tomorrow. Hope you enjoy watching Dallas and Minnesota Game 1. Thank you very much for tuning into Locked on Jazz. We now send you over to the first ever 24/7 national sports channel, Locked on Sports Today. Have a wonderful day. And if you're on audio, go check out Locked on Sports Today on YouTube.